One vital question mark hung over the first half of 1942. How many new divisions could the Russians still create from their reserves? My predecessor had assembled a file of unmistakable indications that the flow of reinforcements to the front was drying up, and he had tried to determine whether this was because the Russians had no fresh manpower reserves available, or whether this indicated they were secretly creating fresh units where to hold in reserve for the summer operations. There were many indications from the interrogation centres and from radio monitoring that workers were being recruited from industry to fight at the front, and in February 1942, a friendly intelligence service supplied us with the resolutions of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, proclaiming something similar to the total war announced by Goebbels in Germany 1 year later. Late in May 1942, I presented my own conclusions on the Russian reserves position to General Haida, and by the following month we had enough information to make a reliable estimate of the size of the reserves. This was an interesting example of the use of both secret data and readily accessible statistical information published by the Soviet Union itself. In its January 1939 popular Taiyan census, the Soviet Union had a total population of 170 million, but natural population growth and the annexation of large parts of Europe had by 1942 swollen this to 199 million. In the course of our operations, we had overrun the most densely inhabited area, with about 1/3 of the entire population of the Soviet Union, some 66 million, of which up to 1/3 had probably been evacuated or drafted into the Russian armed forces. In our calculations, we took into account the fact that the Russian nation was at that time a young one, with almost half the population younger than 20. In Germany, less than 1/3 of the population was under 20, but we found that the high mortality rate and the general ravages of war among the older age groups offset this factor. Thus, on the one hand, a relatively high proportion of the Russian people was of military age, a proportion which would increase in the years that followed, but on the other hand, there could be less recourse to the older age groups than was possible in Germany. The percentage of women in Russia was also unusually high, over 52%, which provided a greater incentive to use female labour in industry. On this purely statistical basis, the Russians could have had only about 17 million men under arms, since experience showed that any given country can mobilise at most 10% of its total population. From our interrogation camps and captured documents, we knew that Russia had called up all able-bodied men from 18 to 45 years of age. Of the 35.4 million men, 28.4 million were able-bodied. There were also indications that in some places, 46 and 47-year-old men were being recruited. Using our own experience in Germany as a basis for calculation, we could assume that 11 million men at most had been placed in reserved draft categories in Russia, and that this figure was probably closer to 9 or 10 million in view of the lost territories. By this method also, we arrived at an estimate of about 17 million able-bodied men able to the Soviet armed forces. From these 17 million had to be subtracted the losses since war broke out. Our army's reports and estimates of our allies assessed these at 430,000 dead and invalided in the war with Finland from 1939 to 1940. And the losses since our own attack on Russia had brought the total to 7,530,000 dead, permanently valided or taken prisoner up to May 1st, 1942. This would leave 9.5 million men in the Soviet armed forces. These were believed to be distributed as follows. Of 7,800,000 active troops, about 6 million were in the army, 1,500,000 in the Air Force, and 300,000 in the Navy. On paper, therefore, the Russians had a man-power reserve of up to 1,700,000 able-bodied men, but for various reasons these could only be made available gradually to the combat units, and several thousand men had to be tied down in the supply, training, clothing, and logistics echelons. There were ways in an emergency in which Russia could theoretically find the manpower to raise new divisions, and we would no doubt learn more as the year progressed. But we had to bear in mind that with Russia we were dealing not with a Central European country, but with half of Asia, a territory 32 times the size of Germany, covering about 1/6 of the Earth's surface. we could safely assume that it would not prove possible for Moscow to tap more than a fraction of these manpower resources. My predecessor had somewhat optimistically concluded in March that the Soviet reserves were virtually exhausted, and added, "Finally, we also had to take into account the increasing rate of deliveries of arms and materials from the United States. The transportation of large quantities of war equipment such as trucks, anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns, shells and bombs, together with tanks and aircraft, had built up initially through Persia. From November 1941 onward, however, the Allies had been making increasing use of the Arctic Sea route to Murmansk. According to prisoners captured during attacks on the Allied convoys, the ships carried foodstuffs, tanks, aircraft engines, guns, and munition. By July 1942, the Allies were estimated to have shipped no fewer than 2,800 tanks to the Soviet Union, and our intelligence suggested that about 30 armoured brigades had put in an appear. Ants on the Eastern Front equipped with British and American tanks. The Russian troops were not very happy with the quality of these tanks, as they were inferior to the Soviet T-34 in every respect, and with their narrow tracks, their cross-country performance was poor. Moreover, their engines could not comfortably digest the low-grade fuels common in the USSR. British and American aircraft had also been severely affected by oil freezing in the sub-zero temperatures. The Russians considered their own makes far superior. By this time, Hitler's major offensive toward the Caucasus was well underway. Voronezh had been captured, our armies had advanced along the Don, and the Volga had just been reached south of Stalingrad. In my view, our forces would shortly succeed in overrunning the oil fields of the Caucasus and consolidating our position on the Volga before winter set in, although we had to expect strong resistance. As early as July 12th, the Russian High Command had created the Stalingrad Front under Marshal Timoshenko, and on the 15th I briefed General Haidar on the new Russian forces appearing in the Eastern Front and on agents' reports that the enemy was preparing for a determined defense of Stalingrad itself. On the following day, Haidar and Heusinger discussed with me the probable scale of the coming battle, and to what extent time was in our favour. As our armies, principally the Sixth Army under General Paulus, advanced further and further towards Stalingrad that summer, General Haidar and I had cast anxious eyes on the lengthening left flank along the Don, and Haidar repeatedly warned of the possibility that Moscow would launch a counterattack on this flank, most probably across that part of the Don that extended between the Koper tributary and the Great Bend at Kremenskaya, for this sector was held not by hardened German forces, but by our Romanian allies. Even if the coming operation was insufficient to destroy the Red Army or bring about an early collapse, the physical occupation of the vital Caucasus region and the blocking of the Volga as a Soviet waterway would cause untold harm to the enemy's economy. But ahead lay yet another Russian winter, in which the enemy could rely on his superiority in winter combat to inflict such manpower and equipment losses on us, that we would have to dismiss all thought of renewing the German offensive in 1943, particularly in view of our obligations in other theatres. I warned that we should be on the lookout for numerous enemy formations specially trained for mobile warfare in winter, and we should expect violent partisan activity in the rear of our armies. It was by no means impossible, I stated in September 1942, that given the sparseness of our front line, these Russian tactics might produce crises like those of the previous winter. By the time the Soviet counterattack began on November 19, 1942, which was to lead eventually to the Stalingrad disaster, my branch Foreign Armies East had predicted 10 days in advance precisely where the blow would fall and which of our armies would be affected. The Stalingrad tragedy marked the turn of the tide in the Eastern Campaign. It heralded the ultimate defeat of the Third Reich. Since the complete file of our branch's brief enemy situation reports is available, our claim to have given good warning is more than substantiated. Between October 25th and November 9th, incoming reports yielded a persistent impression of a weak but steady flow of rain. Forcements to the front facing the Romanian Third Army, although it was not until the latter part of this phase that Soviet intentions became clear to us. We soon received reports about the arrival of further troops at Serafimovich, a town on the Don about 100 miles northwest of Stalingrad. There was heavy transport and loading activity along the railroad line leading to it. Our reconnaissance aircraft could see lights moving at night, and extensive traffic crossing the Don at Kletskaya, about 20 miles closer to Stalin. Grad, it was from Serafimovich and Kletskaya that the first Soviet counterattacks were launched. On October 29th, I took my latest report across to General Zeitzler, the new Army Chief of Staff. Zeitzler, a bustling, stocky, bald-headed dynamo of action, had replaced the exhausted General Haider a month before. My report said, "There is nowhere any sign of preparation for a major attack, but the entire area needs continued intensive observation." 2 days later I repeated this view, but added that there was an increased impression that there might be localized attacks on the Romanian position at Serafimovich, to which I added on November 2nd, "In connection with the increasing troop movements west of Serafimovich, we must expect there to be continued reinforcement of the enemy confront, in the Romanian Third Army, and possibly even an attack. We must await further indications." At the same time, we observed the corresponding withdrawals of troops and equipment from neighboring Russian formations, particularly the 65th and 21st Armies, to build up the sectors from which the Soviet attack would begin. On November 2nd, I reported the first indications of this from radio monitoring reports. On the following day, I cited a number of specific instances where air reconnaissance had observed tanks and field artillery at locations just north of Stalingrad along the German front, disappearing and then reappearing a few days later near Serafimovich. There emerges an increasingly clear picture of preparations for an attack on the Romanian Third Army, though they are still in their early stages, I wrote on November 3rd. We cannot yet be certain whether the object is an attack designed to lure our forces away from Stalingrad, or an operation with a much broader objective. At the time, I tended to favour the former possibility. It was clear from the active reinforcement of Stalingrad and the heavy Soviet air raids on our positions there that the enemy had by no means given up the fight for the city, I added on the 4th. And I mentioned for the first time that there were indications that the Russians were planning further major relief operations from Beketovka, just south of Stalingrad. The reinforcement of the Soviet forces in Serafimovich at the expense of their front line B. Between the Volga and the Don continued over the next few days. Our air reconnaissance detected between 2,000 and 2,500 vehicles moving north of Kletskaya, and we were able to identify the new Russian rifle and armoured divisions concerned. Finally, on Novum. Bear 10, I warned. The appearance of the Soviet headquarters for the southwestern front somewhere to the northwest of Serafimovich indicates that a major enemy attack operation is in sight. From Max, the office controlling the Abwehr agents in Moscow, I had received the following signal a few days earlier. On November 4th, Stalin presided over Council of War in Moscow, attended by 12 marshals and generals. Basic principles were laid down at this council. Operations to be executed cautiously to avoid heavy casualties. B. Loss of ground is unimportant. C. It is vital to salvage industrial and public utility installations in good time by evacuation, which explains orders issued for dispersal of refineries and machine tool factories from Grozny and Makhachkala to New Baku, Orsk and Tashkent. D. Rely only on oneself. Don't count on getting aid from allies. E. Take sharp measures to prevent desertion, either by better propaganda and rations or by firing squads and tougher GPU supervision. And F. All the planned attack operations are to be executed before November 15th if possible, insofar as weather permits. These are primarily from Grozny toward Mozdok, at Nizhny Marmon and Verkhny Marmon in the Don Basin, and at Voronezh, at Rzhev, south of Lake Ilmen, and at Leningrad. The necessary troops are to be brought out of reserve and up to the front line. Events over the following months showed that this report must have been genuine. But what use are the best intelligence reports if one's own forces are too weak to withstand the enemy, or the warnings are not heeded? By November 11th, it was clear that the flow of reinforcements to the Russian front at Serafimovich and Kletskaya was slack, eaning off, and on the 12th I stated in my written report to Gen. Erald Zeitzler, in front of Army Group, Don, the enemy's attack intentions, which we have long suspected, are gradually becoming more clearly defined. in addition to establishing two main groups of forces which we have detected opposite the two wings of the Romanian Third Army, where the enemy can now be said to be ready to attack, there are growing indications that forces are being concentrated still further west, primarily in the Kalach area. We have intercepted radio traffic between the Russian 63rd Army and 6 or 7 unidentified formations, and detected the probable insertion of the 1st Guards Army. Rail traffic to Kalach is possibly transporting sections of the 5th Tank Army, and we also have Abwehr reports of reinforcements arriving at Kalach, and possibly in front of the Hungarians as well. I warned emphatically, while it is not possible to make any overall assessment of the enemy situation with the picture as certain as it is at present, we must expect an early attack on the Romanian Third Army, with the interruption of our railroad to Stalingrad as its objective, so as to endanger all German forces there to the east, and to compel our forces in Stalingrad to withdraw. This will thereby reopen the river Volga as a waterway. That the railroad from Morozovsk to Stalingrad was the objective of the attack had been confirmed by a captured Russian officer. I added that it remained to be seen whether we should also expect a major Russian offensive across the Don against the Italian 8th and the Hungarian 2nd armies, possibly with Rostov as its goal, at staggered intervals after the impending attack on the Romanian Third Army, or whether the Russians would launch simultaneous but somewhat more limited operations against the Italians and Hungarians. While the Russian troops confronting the Romanian Third Army continued to take up their assault positions, according to a deserter, 3 new tank brigades were being brought into the line opposite the Romanian 6th Army Corps. I reported on the 18th that a simultaneous Russian attack from Beketovka, south of Stalingrad, could not be excluded. At 5 the next morning, November 19th, 1942, the Soviet offensive began precisely where we had predicted, from the bridge. Heads of Kletskaya and Serafimovich, under the overall command of the Russian Southwestern Front. On the following morning, a second offensive began from Beketovka, just south of Stalingrad. I reported that day, while it is so far not possible to investigate the tactical situation in the breakthrough locations in detail, it appears probable that a major crisis is now upon us, particularly in consequence of the breach effected in the Romanian 5th Infantry Division. We must expect these attacks to be pressed southward, using the forces held in reserve in the rear for this purpose. On the 22nd, the two arms of the Soviet pincer movement met at Kalach, encircling our 6th Army in Stalingrad, and a number of lesser formations, 250,000 of our finest troops, with 100 tanks, 1,800 guns, and over 10,000 vehicles. The rest of the tragedy belongs to history. Understandably, I was bitter about the outcome. A few days after the last shots were fired in Stalingrad and the starving Nance of Paulus's gallant army had gone into captivity, I wrote a summary asterisk of the lessons to be learned and the causes for the defeat. Any retrospective look at the events since mid-November is bound to be overshadowed by the fact that all of them, with the exception of the first moves in the offensive against the Romanian Third Army, have resulted from a sequence of basic command errors on our side, as to whose extent and effect the military authorities were perfectly aware from the moment they were committed. It is not within the scope of this survey to discuss the reasons why these errors were none the less made. Leaving aside the failure of our allies, the Russians can credit their great victories to the fact that they have applied standard German command principles. Zhukov, as military commander, enjoys complete freedom within the framework of the task assigned to him. The Russians have adopted man tactics and German strategic doctrines. In the meantime, we have borrowed from the Russians their earlier system of rigidly laying down the law on virtually everything and going into the tiniest details, and therein lies the blame for our defeats. German military leaders who can think and act independently are discouraged. Indeed, both such qualities can lead to court-martial. Thus, we have forfeited one of the fundamental requirements of a successful and versatile military command. We have become benumbed and are incapable of strategic action. This introduction was clearly recognizable as a criticism of Adolf Hitler's leadership. I continued by reviewing the military trends we had witnessed since November, and emphasizing that we had always correctly identified the enemy's intentions well in advance. I summarized the mid-November offensive on the Romanian Third Army and our own 6th Army as follows. After General Haida, Seitzler's predecessor as Chief of Staff, had repeatedly warned of the possibility that the enemy would launch an offensive across the Don between the Koper River and the Great Bend. At the end of October and early in November, we identified the first indications of the Ing offensive, which was later to result in the encirclement of the Sixth Army. From November 9th onward, our intelligence digest indicated that a major offensive was being prepared against the Romanian Third Army, and at about the same time, we repeatedly warned of preparations to attack the Italian Eighth and the Hungarian Second Armies and Voronezh. On November 21st, we underlined the enemy's intention of isolating the Sixth Army, and 3 days later, the Sixth Army was indeed encircled. For the sake of history, it must be recorded here that the General Staff was adamant that only the immediate withdrawal of the Sixth Army could save it from annihilation and release the forces that would almost immediately become necessary for the bitter fighting in which Army Group Don became engaged. It was as early as this that, at least in our intelligence digest, we pointed out that only the virtually immediate withdrawal of Army Group A behind the Don, a bold decision but one characteristic of German staff training, while retaining a bridgehead east of the Taman Penin. Sula would leave us with any chance of using these forces to crush the Russian offensive across the middle reaches of the Don and to retain the initiative for a fresh offensive to the south. At the time it was objected that ground conditions in winter would prohibit any such operations, but subsequent developments have refuted that objection with a vengeance. Ludendorff also managed to operate in winter in Poland. The story had been the same with the Soviet offensives against the Italian Eighth Army on December 16th, which had finally sealed General Paulus's fate in Stalingrad, and the assault on the Hungarian Second Army 4 weeks later. Again, we had given aid. Quate warning, as I pointed out in my February 1943 survey Cunning. For example, early in February 1943, it was learned that Soviet agents we captured were under strict orders to play down Russian military capabilities when we interrogated them. And again, their military objectives were well calculated, as we learned from an Abwehr report we received from a recently dispatched agent who had established contact with a Western Allied military mission in Moscow. From time to time, as I shall mention again, the Allies considered it in their own interest to show us some of the cards the Russians were dealing to them. In this case, the Soviet authorities had given the mission a statement on their military objectives. This was in reply to a Wehrmacht communiqué which had stressed that Moscow had attained none of the strategic objectives it had set for its offensives of the winter of 1942-43. The Russian statement read, "The principal Russian strategic objective is not one of regaining lost territory or pushing the enemy back to the west. Rather, the Russian war leadership intends to crush the German army's striking power. This aim can be realized only if Germany's war-making potential, and that means her military equipment, is destroyed. This is the objective of every Russian operation. For this reason, it is of no consequence whatever to the Russian command how many hedgehog defense positions the Germans establish in the Soviet rear, or how many of her soldiers Germany sends to their doom. While the deep Russian strikes may seem to be ambitious or bold operations, or may even seem to have been launched solely with the aim of brushing up the war maps where possible, in reality the aim of these operations has always been to seize the main German supply dumps and destroy them. Conditions on the Eastern Front call for a completely different kind of warfare from that in the rest of Europe. On the Western Front, the German Army Command can place its munitions dumps and other depots hundreds of miles behind the front and still keep its combat units rapidly supplied in an emergency by means of motor transport thanks to the lent and extensive highway networks there. On the Eastern Front, the supply dumps are obliged to remain comparatively close to the fighting front. The frequent and sudden weather changes, with dense snowfalls or sudden thaws, could otherwise result in a unit being cut off from its supplies at a crucial moment when the enemy has launched a surprise attack on it. This is why the Russian High Command has concentrated on the German Army's supply bases in the Caucasus, at Stalingrad and in the Don Bend, and after its careful investigations were complete it committed the Soviet attack former. Tyons accordingly. The collapse of the German front on the Don, at Stalingrad, and in the Caucasus is mainly a consequence consequence of the successful threat of the Russian spearheads into the heart of the German army, which then suddenly found itself deprived of sufficient supplies for relatively long sectors of its front. The enormous quantities of German war equipment, which have already been captured or destroyed by the Soviet forces, are therefore the Russian strategic objective. For the Russians, a small village in which a large munitions dump has been located is more important than any city, however magnificent the winter quarters it might seem to offer the German troops. In countless publications, Germany has repeatedly stressed that this war is primarily an industrial war. In logical progression from this, the Russians are fighting their war against German war industry on the Eastern Front. In the summer of 1943, we shall see that the Soviet military command has achieved a crucial victory by eliminating a significant part of the enemy's heavy and light arms and equipment. It was no easy task to see through the increasingly sophisticated Russian tactics of deception by now. Faked radio messages had initially been easy to detect by sending out reconnaissance aircraft to photograph the areas concerned. But the enemy became more devious. They began faking tank tracks across muddy fields by using rollers or other vehicles. They had learned a lot from their defeats of 1941. From a captured Russian general, we found out that Stalin had established a committee under General Shaposhnikov, his army chief of staff, to investigate the causes of Soviet military unpreparedness. We apparently learned nothing from our errors. Rival decoding. But the enemy became more devious. They began faking tank tracks across muddy fields by using rollers or other vehicles. They had learned a lot from their defeats of 1941. From a captured Russian general, we found out that Stalin had established a committee under General Shaposhnikov, his army chief of staff, to investigate the causes of Soviet military unpreparedness. We apparently learned nothing from our errors. Rival decoding organizations were maintained by Göring's Luftwaffe, by the OKW, by the Foreign Ministry, and by the Navy, a chaotic situation which I was able to prevent in post-war Germany until my retirement. Such decoded material as Foreign Armies East did receive during the war was of great value, particularly for assessing the true conditions behind the enemy lines. For example, in 1942, the OKW forwarded to me such items as a lengthy cable from the Yugoslav ambassador in Kibyshev, to which city the diplomatic corps had been evacuated from Moscow, to his exiled foreign ministry in London, reporting at length on the Soviet agricultural plight. At about the same time, we were reading the cables of the American ambassador to the State Department in Washington, reporting on Soviet labor problems and arms production. From decoded Turkish intelligence cables, we were extracting information on Russian armored brigades. On other occasions, the Turkish foreign minister supplied us with information of interest to us about Russia. The Army's own radio monitoring units also picked up tactical signals from which we could identify the movements of units behind the enemy lines, their supplies of tanks and assault weapons, and whether particular units were preparing to attack or digging into defensive positions. Our cooperation with General Feldgiebel, the chief of Army Signals, was particularly good. Apart from the Abwehr agents themselves, our most important sources of intelligence were captured prisoners and Soviet Army documents. Soviet newspapers, and those of the Western Allies, and Soviet radio also yielded worthwhile information from time to time, despite every effort at censorship. Even the letters the Soviet soldiers received were rewarding reading. By a stroke of luck, Army Group South captured no fewer than 8,000 sacks of Soviet forces mail in the middle of June. I ordered a small army of interpreters to screen every single letter, particularly with regard to Soviet morale, region by region. On July 7, 1943, the first detailed analysis was shown to Zeitzler, and he showed it to Hitler. The letters showed that a food crisis was about to grip the Soviet population, that black market trading was flourishing, and that the civilian population was suffering appalling hardships in support of the fighting front. The report cited some examples of the human tragedies reflected in the captured letters, and commented pointedly, "These were no subhumans, the people who wrote these letters." Accurate though our strategic predictions had proved to be, I was still dissatisfied with our tactical intelligence system. In December 1942, I called a conference of the IC officers at Army and Army Group levels together with my own Group 1. I outlined ODS by which I planned to speed up the inflow of intelligence reports from the front and the subsequent outflow of these reports from my branch. At that time, the system of forwarding aerial recon. Nascent's reports was a constant source of worry, as they usually reached my branch untimed, undated, and so late as to permit at best a retrospective survey of events. The daily reconnaissance reports forwarded by the Army Group Ikes were of great importance, but they did not always arrive soon enough for us to digest them in time for the Führer's conference. To speed up the process, I introduced a new system of telephoning reports through, so that the verbal reports from the reconnaissance units reached the air intelligence officers at Army headquarters level by 7 p.m. each day. Thus, the night's reports reached the OKW and General Staff by 7 a.m. I also insisted that these verbal reports be made regularly and on time, whether or not all the facts were known. An incomplete report was better than none when my Group I began its editing work each day. I insisted on the same procedure with the reports on the enemy's artillery strength, since if these reached the General Staff on time, they provided a valuable parameter for assessing the enemy's strength, particularly with regard to whether he was regrouping or creating new units. I introduced a system of 10-day reports on the enemy's artillery situation. They were initially greeted with some skepticism, but later widely accepted for the valuable state meant that they were. The Soviet winter offensive ended late in March 1943 with our victorious battle for Kharkov. Hitler now needed a major offensive victory to turn the tide on the Eastern Front, and he picked the tempting Russian salient at Kursk, where he could both capture large quantities of Russian equipment and troops and shorten his own front by some 150 miles. On April 15th, he issued his orders for the offensive, which was codenamed Citadel. It was to place the initiative for the coming spring and summer campaigns firmly in German hands again. The victory at Kursk must act as a beacon to the world. Hitler proposed to launch the attack late in May, as soon as his tank divisions were refreshed. Over the weeks that followed, his armoured divisions gathered in the Oral Bend, waiting to attack. But now Hitler repeatedly postponed the date, first for one reason, then another, while the Russians, who were fully aware of our intentions, took the appropriate measures and prepared a daunting system of defences extending some 150 miles back from the front line. With each week that passed, our prospects of success lessened. Whereas initially the War Department and my own branch had been confident of victory at Kursk, by late June we were confident of defeat. My branch reported in compelling detail on the Soviet defensive preparations. On April 17th, we received from a reliable agent the information that 6 days later Stalin was summoning his sector and army commanders to Moscow to discuss the indications of a German offensive. Another reliable agent reported on the 27th that an incomplete rifle division, a tank brigade, 2 tank battalions, and 2 field artillery regiments had arrived at Valoiki from Saratov. Valoiki was opposite the starting point for the southern pincer arm of Citadel, and that every day tanks, engines, and tank guns were leaving the tank factories at Kazan and Gorky, bound for the sector of the front in the vicinity of Kupiansk, Kursk, and Orel, that is, the Citadel area. On April 28th, an untried agent reported that the Russians expected their enemy would soon mount a major offensive in the area between Kharkov and Kursk. From such Abwehr reports, there was no doubt that the Soviet High Command had learned of our intentions and was taking the necessary countermeasures. By the time Citadel was finally launched on July 5th, it was clear that we had lost the advantages of both strategic and tactical surprise. I had taken every opportunity, as the files of Foreign Armies East show, to warn the German command against the plan for this major offensive. Since Hitler refused to be dissuaded, on July 3rd I wrote an emphatic warning of the likely outcome, under the title, Appreciation of the Enemy's Moves, if Operation Citadel is carried out. Once Operation Citadel begins, the enemy can either restrict his countermeasures to the Citadel operational area, blocking our attack, if necessary by bringing up reserves from neighbouring areas, by remaining generally on the defensive apart from minor counterattacks. Or, if the enemy considers the overall war picture warrants such action, he will launch the offensives he has already prepared against Army Group South and Army Group Centre, while still blocking citadel. In view of their degree of readiness to attack, and with regard to the situation in the Mediterranean, the latter appears the more probable of the two alternatives, although we cannot exclude an initially limited reaction to citadel. We therefore have to expect that probably soon after our offensive begins, the Russians will mount strong diversionary attacks and counter. Attacks in those sections of the front held by army groups south and centre where we have detected their preparations to attack. I added that if the Russians should unexpectedly concentrate their countermeasures on the citadel area and the front line in the immediate vicinity, we would have to expect them to move considerable reinforcements to Kursk from other areas if the fighting continued very long. From the point of view of the general war situation, there is not one ground that could justify launching Operation Citadel at the present juncture. The prerequisite for victory in the offensive is twofold. We should have numerical superiority and the advantage of surprise. At the time originally planned for the launching of the offensive, both conditions were met. But now, from what we see of the enemy situation, neither is met. For weeks the Russians have been just waiting for our attack in the very sector that we have picked for the offensive, and with their customary energy they have done everything in their power, constructing line upon line of fortifications one behind the other and moving up the necessary forces to halt our offensive as soon as it begins. Thus there is little likelihood that the German offensive will achieve a strategic breakthrough. Taking into account the total reserves available to the Russians, we are not even entitled to assume that Citadel will cost them so much in strength that they will later be capable of carrying out their general plan at the time they choose. On the German side, our reserves, which will become so desperately necessary as the war situation develops, particularly in the Mediterranean, will be tied down and thrown away uselessly. I consider the operation that has been planned a particularly grave error, for which we shall suffer later. The German offensive began next morning, with about 2,000 tanks and 1,800 aircraft starting the pincer movement toward Kursk. The going was heavy, the rate of advance was slow, and the Russians doggedly defended every inch of the ground. We later captured an enemy document listing all but one of the divisions we had marshalled for the offensive. On July 10th in the Mediterranean, the British and American forces invaded Sicily, and on the 12th, precisely the move foreign armies east had anticipated occurred. The Russians launched a counter-offensive toward Orel, with a simultaneous counterattack by strong forces at the southern end of the Kursk salient. On the following day, with some 17,000 Soviet troops killed, and 3,300 of our own, Hitler ordered Operation Citadel stopped. That day I congratulated my staff on the bitter fulfillment of our prophecies. The Head, Foreign Armies. East Headquarters, July 13, 1943. The course of the fighting on the Eastern Front these last few days has once again confirmed precisely every detail of the intelligence picture of the enemy we produced despite formidable obstacles that were put in the way of our assessment of the enemy's distribution of forces. The Chief of Staff, Zeitzler, expressed particular commendation for this a few days ago. I know this excellent result is the consequence of the hard work and magnificent cooperation of all this branch's staff and experts, and of the support it enjoyed from the other agencies such as Air Intelligence, the Controller of Signals, Reconnaissance, and Wally Wand. I wish to thank all the staff and to express my hope that they will continue to do the job assigned to us with the same effort and enthusiasm. Galen * Operation Citadel was the last German attempt at a strategic offensive in the Russian campaign. With its failure, the tide of the war in Russia finally turned against us. The German army was forced onto the defensive and never regained the initiative. Foreign Armies East continued to do its duty, to reconnoitre the enemy's positions and strength and to obtain the necessary facts for the manned decisions, as well as we were able. We produced intelligence digests and showed which enemy moves we considered most probable. But the more our predictions were confirmed by subsequent events, the less Hitler as Supreme Commander was inclined to heed our reports, which were shown to him by Zeitzler. By this time, I had come to the conclusion that the Russians had an excellently informed source working for them in the German Supreme Command. Canaris and I repeatedly observed quite independently of one another, that the enemy was receiving rapid and detailed information on incidents and top-level decision-making on the German side. Admiral Canaris came to my headquarters at Angerburg one day and, in the course of a lengthy conversation, indicated whom he suspected to be the traitor, although I believe that even so he knew more than he told me. It was a personality about whom I had had my own doubts for some time. The secret was carefully preserved by the Russians, both then and after. Ward and I fully believed it myself only years after the war, when I came into possession of certain information as head of the Gehlen organization in West Germany. What Canaris told me concerned the fateful role in which Hitler's closest confidant, Martin Bormann, was cast in the last war years and in the post-war epoch too. Bormann, who had been Hitler's personal secretary since early 1943 and chief of the Nazi Party organization ever since Rudolf Hess's flight to Scotland in May 1941, was Moscow's most prominent informant and advisor from the very moment the campaign against Russia started. There is no foundation whatever for the allegations which have been made from time to time to the effect that Bormann is alive and well, live. In the impenetrable jungle between Paraguay and Argentina, surrounded by heavily armed bodyguards. He crossed to the Rus, Sians, in May 1945 and was taken back to the Soviet Union. At the time, I believe, Canaris lacked proof. Our suspicions were largely confirmed when, independently of one another, we found out that Bormann and his group were operating an unsupervised radio transmitter network and using it to send coded messages to Moscow. When the OKW monitors reported this, Canaris mandated an investigation. But word came back that Hitler himself had emphatically forbidden any intervention. He had been informed in advance by Bormann of these Funkspieler, or fake radio messages, he said, and he had approved them. This was the sum of our knoll, edge, at the end of the war. Canaris and I both realized it was out of the question to put watchdogs on Bormann, the most powerful man next to Hitler in the Nazi hierarchy, and neither of us was in any position to denounce the Reichsleiter with any prospect of success. The disdain Hitler had shown for my own intelligence sum. Marie's, however right they had later proven, was one factor, and the increasingly exposed position of Canaris and the Abwehr was another. The smallest slip would have put an end to our investigator, Tyons, and probably to us as well. Canaris described to me his grounds for suspecting Bormann, and told me what he assumed to be the reasons for his treachery. He would not exclude the possibility that Bormann was being blackmailed, but he was inclined to see the real motives in the Reichsleiter's immense and insatiable ambition. He was tortured by complexes toward the milieu in which he found himself, and driven by the ambition to succeed Hitler when the day came. We now know, of course, how cunningly Bormann succeeded in bringing first Goering and then Goebbels into discredit with Hitler, for they were his great rivals. It was not until after 1946, when I headed my own intelligence organization, that I had an opportunity to look into Bormann's mysterious escape from Hitler's Berlin bunker and his subsequent disappearance. Some time later, I received conclusive proof of Bormann's post-war movements. During the 1950s, I was passed two separate reports from behind the Iron Curtain, to the effect that Bormann had been a Soviet agent and had lived after the war in the Soviet Union under perfect cover as an advisor to the Moscow government, and has died in the meantime.